The world of the Mistfall pack was painted in shades of gray. The sky above their territory seemed to be in a permanent state of twilight, and a damp chill clung to the air, seeping into the bones of every wolf who called it home. It was a place of quiet struggle, a pack that had long ago lost its strength and its pride, surviving on the fringes of the great Lycan kingdoms. And in this gray world, lived a young woman named Freya, who felt the grayness more deeply than anyone. Freya was different. It wasn't anything she could easily point to, like the color of her hair or the sound of her voice. It was a feeling, a quiet knowing that she didn't fit the mold of the Mistfall wolves. They were cautious and fearful, their eyes always darting towards the shadows of the forest as if expecting a threat. Freya, however, would often find herself looking up at the stars, wondering about the world beyond the thick, gloomy trees that encircled their territory. She felt a pull towards something more, a longing for warmth and light that her current life could never provide. The other pack members sensed this difference in her, and it made them wary. They treated her not with cruelty, but with a distant indifference, like she was a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the rest of the room. The pack was led by Alpha Brock, a man whose size was the only thing about him that was large. His leadership was small, built on fear and a desperate desire to hold on to the little power he had. He ruled not with strength, but with bluster and bullying, always looking for the easiest way out of any problem. Freya had never trusted him. There was a shiftiness in his eyes, a constant calculation that made her skin crawl. The trouble began, as it often did, with Brock's greed. Deep in the heart of the forest lay the sacred hunting grounds of the Silvermane Kingdom, ruled by the most powerful Lycan in the land, King Thane. The boundaries were clearly marked, a law known to every wolf, great and small. To hunt there without permission was a grave insult, a challenge to the king's authority. But the prey in those woods was fat and plentiful, a tempting prize for a pack that often went hungry. Brock, thinking himself clever, believed he could sneak in, take a deer, and no one would be the wiser. He was wrong. King Thane's guards were as swift as the wind and as sharp as their claws. They caught Brock in the act, and the news was delivered to the Mistfall pack with cold, formal precision. A blood debt had been incurred. A life for a life, a price for the stolen hunt and the broken law. The entire pack gathered in the main clearing, a nervous energy buzzing among them. Freya stood at the back, her heart pounding with a dread she didn't understand. Brock stood before his people, trying to look brave, but the sweat on his brow betrayed his fear. "The Lycan King demands payment," he announced, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "A blood debt must be settled or our whole pack will suffer his wrath." Whispers of fear rippled through the crowd. What would the king take? Their land? Their food stores? Would he demand a warrior for a fight to the death? Freya watched, her stomach twisting into knots. She saw the way Brock's eyes scanned the crowd, not with the concern of a leader for his people, but with the frantic calculation of a cornered animal. And then his gaze stopped on her. A cold silence fell. All eyes turned to follow their alpha stare, landing on Freya. She felt 100 pairs of eyes upon her, and the air grew thick and hard to breathe. "There is a way," Brock said, his voice dropping to a oily, persuasive tone. "A way to settle this debt without losing our land or our fighters. The king is a practical ruler. He values unique things." He took a step towards Freya. Freya has always been special. Different. Perhaps the king would see value in that. Perhaps offering her in service to his household would be a worthy payment. A life of service to pay for a life taken. The words hung in the air, ugly and final. Freya felt the world tilt around her. She wasn't being asked, she was being sold. Her worth was being measured not as a person, but as an object to be traded to save the skin of a cowardly alpha. The betrayal was so complete, so cold, that it stole the breath from her lungs. The pack members, relieved that the punishment would not fall on them, avoided her gaze. No one spoke up for her. No one met her pleading eyes. In that moment, the gray world of Mistfall pack turned ice cold. There were no goodbyes. There were no tears except the ones Freya cried silently inside. She was given a small bag with a few belongings and escorted to the edge of their territory by 2 of Brock's warriors. They handed her over to a single stern-faced Lycan guard from King Thane's kingdom as if she were a package. The guard, a man named Soren, gave her a brief, appraising look. His expression was not unkind, but it was unreadable. The journey to the Silvermane Kingdom was a blur of fear and heartache. The forest changed as they traveled. The gloomy, twisted trees of Mistfall gave way to tall, majestic pines that reached for the sky. The air grew clearer and colder, filled with the scent of snow and pine needles. And then she saw it. The castle. It was not a dark, scary fortress, but an immense structure of pale gray stone, built into the side of a mountain with towers that pierced the clouds. It was powerful and imposing, a testament to the strength of the king who lived within. As she walked through the massive gates, the sheer scale of everything made her feel incredibly small. The ceilings were impossibly high, and the hallways echoed with a profound silence. She was led to a room, not a dungeon cell but a real chamber with a bed, a window and a fireplace. It was more comfortable than any room she'd ever had, but the luxury felt like a gilded cage. She was alone, far from home, sold to a king she had never met to pay for a crime she did not commit. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out the window at the unfamiliar stars, and wondered what terrible fate awaited her when she finally came face to face with the legendary Lycan King Thane. The first night in the Silvermane Castle was the longest of Freya's life. The bed was softer than any she had ever known, the blankets woven from a wool that felt like a cloud against her skin, but these comforts were a cruel mockery. Every whisper of the wind against the stone walls sounded like a threat, every settling creak of the ancient fortress echoed like a footstep approaching her door. She was a creature of the forest, used to the sounds of owls and rustling leaves, but this immense, man-made silence was terrifying. She spent the hours curled in a tight ball, not sleeping but simply waiting for the dawn to break and with it, the judgment of the king. When pale gray light finally filtered through the window, illuminating the elegant, sparse room, it felt less like a new day and more like the arrival of her sentencing. A quiet knock came at the door just as the sun cleared the mountain peaks. It was not a guard, but a woman with kind eyes and silver streaks in her dark hair, who introduced herself as Alara, the head of the household staff. She carried a tray with breakfast, warm bread, honey and a piece of fruit, and set it down without a word. Her movements were efficient but not unkind. She laid out a simple clean dress for Freya, a deep blue wool that was far finer than the patched and faded clothes she had arrived in. "The king will see you when you are ready," Alara said, her voice low and calm. "There is no hurry. Gather your strength." Her demeanor was so contrary to the fear churning in Freya's stomach that it only confused her more. Was this a final kindness before execution? When she could delay no longer, Freya was escorted by Soren, the same guard who had brought her to the castle. His presence was a solid, silent wall of muscle and duty. They walked through corridors adorned with tapestries depicting great battles and histories of the Lycan people, past windows that looked out over a breathtaking kingdom of sharp peaks and deep, green valleys. It was a place of immense power and order, a world away from the shabby, chaotic existence of the Mistfall Pack. Finally they reached a set of enormous, carved wooden doors. Soren pushed one open and gestured for her to enter, remaining outside himself. The throne room was vast, with a ceiling so high it was lost in shadow. A path of dark stone led to a dais, and upon it sat a throne made of interwoven antlers and silver. And on that throne sat King Thane. Freya's breath caught in her throat. She had expected a monster, a grizzled old warrior scarred by battle and cruelty. The man before her was young, perhaps in his prime, with a stern, handsome face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. His hair was the color of dark ash, and his eyes, which watched her every step as she approached, were a piercing, unusual shade of amber like molten gold. He was not lounging on his throne. He sat straight, his broad shoulders squared, every inch a ruler. He radiated an aura of power that was so palpable it felt like a physical pressure in the room, making the air itself feel heavy. Freya forced herself to walk forward, her knees trembling so badly she feared they would buckle. She stopped at the base of the dais, her head bowed, waiting. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. "Look at me." The king's voice was not a roar, but a low, resonant command that vibrated through the stone floor. It held no anger, only an absolute authority. Slowly, Freya lifted her gaze to meet his. Up close, his eyes were even more startling. And in their golden depths, she did not see the expected rage or contempt. She saw a deep, weary intensity, a loneliness so profound it seemed to have worn grooves into his soul. "Your Alpha Brock," Thane began, his tone matter-of-fact, "committed a crime against this kingdom. The law is clear. A debt was owed. He offered you as payment. Do you understand this?" Freya found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "I understand, Your Majesty." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze seeming to weigh and measure every part of her. "I am told your name is Freya. Do you know why you are here, Freya? Not the debt. The true reason." She shook her head, unable to form another word. "Brock is a coward," Thane stated, a flicker of disgust in his eyes. "He believes he has pawned off a burden, sent a weak member of his pack to appease an angry king. He thinks he has won. But a Lycan's word is a bond. A deal has been struck. The debt is settled. You are not a prisoner here. A spark of confusion fought through her fear. Not a prisoner? Thane leaned forward slightly, his amber eyes locking onto hers. However, you are now under my protection. And my first duty is to ensure the safety of what is mine. You will remain within the walls of this castle. The forests beyond are not safe for someone unfamiliar with our territory, or for someone who might be seen as a political object. He paused, letting the implication sink in. Other packs, rivals, might seek to capture her to use against him. You will have the freedom of the castle and its inner gardens. You will be treated with the respect accorded to an honored guest. But you will not leave. This is not a punishment. It is a necessity. Do you accept these terms? It was not the harsh imprisonment she had imagined. It was a bargain strangely fair. He was offering her safety, a roof, food, and a strange, limited kind of freedom. What choice did she really have? To run back to the pack that sold her? To face the wilderness alone? I accept, Freya said, her voice gaining a little strength. A nod, almost imperceptible. Good. Soren will show you the areas you may frequent. Elara will see to your needs. He gestured a dismissal, his attention already seeming to drift to a parchment on a table beside his throne. The audience was over. That night, sleep was again elusive. The king's words echoed in her mind. Honored guest. The concept was so foreign it felt like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Restless, she left her room and found her way to the inner gardens Elara had mentioned earlier. It was a walled courtyard open to the sky, filled with night-blooming flowers whose sweet scent filled the cold air. The moon, a sharp silver sliver, cast long shadows. And there, standing by a frozen fountain, was the king. He had shed his formal cloak and looked less like a monarch and more like a man, his profile sharp against the moonlight. He turned as she approached, and for a moment she feared she had broken a rule. But he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. You cannot sleep either, he said. It wasn't a question. The silence is loud, Freya admitted hesitantly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. You get used to it, or you never do. I haven't decided which. He looked up at the stars. Your old alpha. Tell me of him. The question surprised her. She could have lied, could have pretended loyalty to her pack. But something in the quiet of the garden, in the strange vulnerability of this nighttime meeting, compelled honesty. He is a coward, she said, echoing Thane's own words. He rules by making others feel small. There is no loyalty in him, only fear. Thane listened, his gaze still fixed on the heavens. Loyalty is the foundation of everything, he said, his voice low. Without it, a pack is just a group of individuals waiting to scatter at the first sign of trouble. A king without the loyalty of his people rules nothing but empty stone. He finally looked at her, and the weariness was back in his eyes, but so was a flicker of curiosity. You are honest? That is a rare thing. He didn't say anything else. He simply turned and walked back towards the castle, leaving her alone in the moonlit garden. But the encounter had shifted something inside Freya. The terrifying Lycan King had a name, Thane, and he had spoken to her not as a possession, but as a person. The walls of her gilded cage for the first time felt just a little less solid. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a bewildering and dangerous thread of curiosity. The days that followed Freya's encounter in the moonlit garden settled into a rhythm that was both strange and surprisingly peaceful. The initial, paralyzing fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity about her new world. The castle, which had first felt like a cold and echoing tomb, slowly began to reveal its secrets to her. She learned the patterns of the household, the times when the great halls were bustling with activity and the times when they were hushed and still. Elara, the kind-eyed woman, became a quiet anchor, often finding small tasks for Freya, sorting herbs in the kitchen or arranging flowers for the main hall, not as commands from a master to a servant, but as gestures of inclusion, a way to make her feel less like a ghost haunting the corridors. It was during these tasks that Freya began to learn about the Lycan people from the staff, who slowly warmed to the quiet, earnest young woman from the weak pack. They spoke of their king not with terror, but with a fierce, protective respect. They told her of his fairness, of how he worked tirelessly to ensure the safety and prosperity of the kingdom. They spoke of battles he had fought to secure their borders, not for glory but for peace. This image of Thane as a protector, a guardian, was so different from the vengeful ruler she had been taught to expect. It painted the man she had met in the garden in a new, more complex light. The most significant change, however, came during the meals. For the first week, her food had been brought to her room. Then, one evening, a young servant arrived with a simple invitation. The king requested her presence at his table. The request, not a command, sent a fresh wave of nerves through her. She expected a formal, silent affair, with Thane looming at the head of a long table. Instead, she was led to a small, private solar adjacent to the great hall. A round table was set near a roaring fireplace with only 2 chairs. Thane was already there, having changed out of his formal attire into a simple, dark tunic. He stood as she entered, a gesture of startling courtesy. The meal was quiet at first, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the clink of cutlery. But then Thane asked her a question. Not about her pack or the debt, but about the books she saw on a shelf in the corner. Did she enjoy reading? The question broke the dam of formality. Freya, who had devoured every scrap of written word she could find in her old pack's meager library, found her voice. She spoke of stories of adventure and histories of forgotten lands. To her astonishment, Thane listened, his intense gaze focused on her, and then he began to speak himself. He told her of Lycan histories, of the great migrations and the founding of the Silvermane Kingdom. He spoke of the stars not just as pretty lights, but as navigational guides his scouts used. He was not lecturing her, he was sharing his world. And once, when she made a quiet observation about a character in a story she'd loved, a low, genuine laugh rumbled from his chest. The sound was so unexpected, so rich and warm, that it seemed to startle them both. For a moment, the weight of kingship lifted from his shoulders, and Freya saw not a king but a man. A lonely, intelligent man who was, for the first time in a long time, enjoying a conversation. These dinners became a regular occurrence. It was the one part of the day Thane seemed to guard jealously, a space where reports and petitions were not allowed. They talked of everything and nothing. Freya found herself telling him about her childhood, about feeling like an outsider, about her love for the deep, quiet parts of the forest. She spoke without the fear of judgment she had always felt in her old pack. Thane, in turn, began to share small pieces of himself. His frustration with stubborn clan leaders, his fondness for a particular breed of hawk that nested in the high peaks, his quiet hope for a lasting peace. A fragile trust was being built, brick by brick, word by word. Freya began to look forward to the evenings, to the way his amber eyes would soften when he was deep in thought, to the small, rare smiles that felt like a secret gift meant only for her. The initial spark of curiosity was fanning into a warm, dangerous glow of affection. One afternoon, as Freya was walking along the high battlements, feeling the crisp wind on her face, Soren approached her. His usual stern expression was tempered with a thoughtful look. "The king is in council today," Soren said, leaning on the stone wall beside her. "He asked me to ensure you had what you needed." "I'm fine, thank you, Soren," Freya replied, touched by the consideration. Soren was silent for a moment, watching the guards training in the courtyard far below. "He has not had a meal in the great hall since you arrived," he remarked, his tone casual but his words deliberate. "He prefers the solar. It is quieter." Freya didn't know what to say. She simply waited. Soren turned his head to look at her directly. "You should know something, Freya. The order to keep you within the walls, it is not just about your safety from the wilds or even from rival packs." He lowered his voice. "Brock, your former alpha, has been making noises. He boasts in taverns that he has tricked the great Lycan King. He claims he sold you for a high price and that he holds influence here now. There are those who might believe him. There are those who might seek to take you to see what value you truly hold, or to use you to provoke the king." The truth of her situation settled over her, colder than the mountain air. She was not just a guest, she was a pawn in a game she hadn't known she was playing. Thane wasn't just protecting her. He was protecting his kingdom from a potential threat that her very presence represented. Soren saw the understanding dawn on her face. "The king has borne the weight of this crown alone for many years," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "He carries the loneliness like a cloak. But these past weeks, the silence in the castle has felt different. Less empty." He gave her a meaningful look. "You bring him a peace he has not known. Remember that." With that, he nodded and walked away, leaving Freya alone with her whirling thoughts. The kindness of the staff, the shared meals, the conversations, it all clicked into place. Thane's protection was not the act of a owner securing his property. It was the action of a man shielding something precious he had unexpectedly found. The warmth she felt for him was no longer just a confused flutter in her chest. It was a deep, undeniable current pulling her toward him. She cared for him. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The gilded cage had vanished entirely. In its place was a castle that was starting to feel, for the first time in her life, like a home. And at the center of it all was the complex, lonely king who was slowly, surely, capturing her heart. The newfound sense of peace Freya had discovered within the castle walls was a fragile thing, and like all fragile things, it was destined to be tested. The knowledge Soren had shared about Brock's boasting festered in the back of her mind, a dark spot on the brightening canvas of her new life. It made her more cautious during her walks in the inner garden, her eyes occasionally darting towards the high walls, not with a desire to escape, but with a new wariness of what might lie beyond them. Yet, the daily rhythms with Thane continued to weave their spell. Each shared meal, each conversation that stretched longer into the evening, each time his hand accidentally brushed against hers when passing a dish, solidified the bond growing between them. It was a silent, unspoken thing, a language of glances and small gestures that spoke volumes more than words ever could. It was this very bond that Thane himself was beginning to feel, a disturbance in the solitary equilibrium of his existence. He found his thoughts drifting to Freya during council meetings, wondering what she might think of a particular trade dispute or a boundary appeal. Her perspective, born outside the rigid structures of Lycan politics, was refreshingly clear and honest. He began to seek her out not just at dinner, but in the afternoons, inventing flimsy pretexts to show her the castle's library or to walk with her along the sun-drenched battlements. The fierce protectiveness he felt for her had shifted. It was no longer just the duty of a king to a guest under his roof. It was a deeper, more primal urge. It was a feeling that both thrilled and terrified him, a feeling he had long buried under the weight of his crown, the stirring of a mate bond. This internal turmoil was what led him to the training grounds one afternoon, seeking the familiar physical release of combat to clear his head. He was sparring with Soren, their movements a blur of controlled power, when a sudden searing jolt of pure panic shot through him. It was not his own fear. It was a foreign, desperate emotion that slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. It was Freya's fear. He froze mid-movement, his amber eyes widening. Soren, recognizing the shock on his king's face, immediately lowered his weapon. "Thane? What is it?" Thane didn't answer. He was already turning, his senses stretching out, homing in on the source of that psychic scream like a compass needle finding north. He knew exactly where she was, near the edge of the forest just beyond the castle's outer walls, a place she had expressed a desire to see from a distance. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, undiluted fury. Without a word to Soren, he moved, his human form blurring as he unleashed the immense speed of his Lycan nature, a streak of fury racing towards the woods. Freya had only wanted to see the wildflowers that grew in the meadow bordering the forest. She had stayed well within the boundary Soren had shown her, or so she thought. The sun was warm on her face and for a moment she had closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth, feeling a happiness so profound it was almost painful. That was when the hands grabbed her. Rough, calloused hands clamped over her mouth and dragged her backwards into the treeline. She struggled, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The familiar, hated scent of her old pack filled her nostrils. Brock's face, twisted with greed and triumph, loomed over her. "Thought you were living the high life, did you?" he sneered. "You're worth more to me back in my possession. The Lycan King will pay a fortune to get his pretty little pet back." Terror threatened to swallow her whole. But beneath the terror, something else surged, a fierce, defiant anger. This man had sold her, and now he wanted to steal her back, to treat her like an object to be traded again. As his warriors tightened their grip, a desperate, wild energy exploded from within her. She threw her head back and screamed, a raw, powerful sound that was more than just a cry for help. As the sound tore from her throat, a brilliant, silvery light erupted from her body, a shockwave of pure energy that pulsed outwards. It was instinctual, a power she never knew she possessed. The light didn't harm her captors, but it stunned them, causing them to stagger back, momentarily blinded and disoriented, their grips loosening. That single moment of surprise was all that was needed. A roar that shook the very trees themselves tore through the forest. It was a sound of absolute, apocalyptic rage. And then Thane was there. But it was not the king Freya knew. This was the Lycan in his full, terrifying glory. He was immense, a giant of muscle and dark fur, his eyes burning with the same molten gold fire, but now filled with a killing intent. He moved with a speed that was impossible to follow. He was a whirlwind of claws and fury, a force of nature unleashed. Brock's warriors, brave against a lone woman, were nothing before the king's wrath. They were disarmed and thrown aside like rag dolls, their whimpers of fear a stark contrast to Thane's enraged snarls. Brock, his courage evaporating, turned to run, but a single swipe of a massive paw sent him crashing into a tree, where he slumped, unconscious. The entire fight lasted less than 10 seconds. As quickly as the fury had come, it vanished. The giant Lycan turned, its chest heaving, its fearsome gaze searching for Freya. She was pressed against a tree, trembling, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. The great beast approached her, but its movements were now slow, deliberate. It lowered its massive head, and then, in a shimmer of light and a contraction of form, Thane stood before her in his human shape, his chest still rising and falling rapidly, his face a mask of concern. "Freya?" he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. He didn't touch her, giving her space, his hands clenched at his sides as if fighting the urge to pull her into his arms. "Are you hurt?" She could only shake her head, her gaze fixed on him, on the raw power and the equally raw care warring in his expression. The silvery light that had flashed from her had faded, but the memory of it hung in the air between them. Thane's eyes scanned her, and then he looked at the spot where the light had emanated. The anger in his face softened, replaced by a look of profound wonder. He took a careful step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking a sacred truth. "Freya," he said again, his golden eyes searching hers. "That light? No ordinary werewolf can summon such a thing." He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, the touch sending a jolt through both of them. "That is the power of a true Lycan. A royal Lycan." He paused, the weight of centuries in his gaze. There was a prophecy, of a queen with a hidden light who would bring strength to the throne. He swallowed, the truth dawning on him with absolute, life-altering clarity. "You are not a debt to be paid, Freya. You are my destined mate." The silence in Thane's private chambers was thick and heavy, but it was no longer the cold, fearful silence of Freya's first nights in the castle. This was a silence brimming with unspoken words, with the echo of a revelation that had shattered the very foundation of the world they both knew. Freya sat by the fireplace, a warm blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring into the dancing flames. She could still feel the ghost of the rough hands that had grabbed her, but those sensations were being steadily overwritten by the memory of Thane's transformation, the fury in his eyes that was entirely for her protection, and the stunning gentleness in his touch afterwards. And then his words, "Destined mate." The words echoed each time, feeling more immense, more impossible, and yet, deep in her soul, more undeniably true. Thane stood by the window, his back to her, watching the moon rise over his kingdom. His mind was a storm. The primal, possessive fury he had felt was not just that of a king, but that of a mate whose other half was threatened. The prophecy, an old tale he had long considered a fanciful myth, was now living, breathing reality in the form of the quiet, brave woman sitting by his fire. He had brought her here as a settlement, a transaction to balance a ledger. Now he understood that fate, or something far greater, had guided Brock's cowardly hand. It had not been a debt that was paid, it had been a delivery. The most important delivery of his life. 4 days, a new, delicate dance began between them. The shared meals continued, but the conversations were different. Thane spoke not just of his kingdom's present, but of its past. He told her of the long line of kings and queens who had ruled before him, of the weight of that legacy, and of the profound loneliness that came with a crown that had never felt meant to be worn alone. He spoke of the mate bond not as a simple romantic feeling, but as a deep, spiritual connection that bound two souls together, making each stronger, wiser, and more complete than they could ever be apart. He showed her the history of his people in the castle's oldest tapestries, pointing out queens who had ruled with compassion and strength, their stories mirroring the hidden power he had seen flare from Freya in the forest. Freya listened, her heart and mind opening to a destiny she had never dared to imagine. She saw the vulnerability in this powerful king, the earnest hope in his golden eyes when he looked at her. She thought of her life in the Mistfall Pack, where she had been an outcast, a burden, a piece of property to be sold. Here in this mighty castle, Thane saw her as a partner. He valued her thoughts, he protected her with his entire being, and he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. The warmth she felt for him blossomed into a profound, unwavering love. It was not a love born of gratitude for being saved, but a love born of truly seeing and being seen by another soul. One evening, they found themselves back in the moonlit garden where their strange connection had first begun to grow. The air was cold and clear, the stars like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Thane turned to her, his expression serious but filled with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Freya," he began, his voice low and earnest, "I have told you of the mate bond. I have felt it from the moment I saw you in the forest, a truth my soul recognized even when my mind did not. But I am a king, and you have had choices taken from you your entire life." He took her hands in his touch warm and sure. "I will not be another person who forces your path. The bond means nothing if it is not a choice. You must choose this. You must choose me. Not as a king settling a debt, but as a man asking the woman he loves to stand beside him. Will you be my queen? Not because of a prophecy but because your heart leads you to me." Tears welled in Freya's eyes, but they were tears of joy, of finally coming home. She looked at their joined hands, then up into the face of the king who had offered her not a cage but a crown. Not an order but a question. She thought of the gray world she had left behind and the vibrant, challenging, love-filled future that lay before her. "My pack sold me to settle a debt," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying on the quiet night air. "They thought they were discarding something worthless. But they were wrong. They delivered me to my destiny." She squeezed his hands, her love for him shining brightly in her eyes, a light that rivaled the moon above. "Thane, my heart has already chosen you. It chose you in this garden, it chose you at our dinners, and it chose you forever when you fought for me. I love you. Not because you are a king but because you are the other half of my soul. I will be your queen. I will stand by your side today and always." Under the witness of the moon and stars, Thane pulled her into his arms, his embrace saying everything words could not. It was a promise, a sealing of their bond, a beginning. In the days that followed, Freya embraced her new life, her inner light now shining openly beside Thane's strength. They ruled together not as a king and a paid debt, but as true mates, their love the foundation of a new era of peace and prosperity for the Silvermane Kingdom. The lonely castle became a true home, filled with a warmth that had been absent for centuries, all because a debt led to the greatest treasure a king could ever find. If you've been swept away by the romance of Freya and Thane, and you want to discover more stories where love triumphs over all, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more epic tales of destiny, courage, and heart to life.